Hello and welcome to another episode of Scream Theory. So this is going to be just a quick two-part video series where I talk about some common mistakes and provide some tips for people learning false chord vocals. This video is going to be meant for beginners, and then the next video is going to be meant for more advanced and intermediate level practitioners. And I would say that a person who is within their first 5 months of regularly practicing false chord vocals is a beginner. Hopefully this video will help and make things less confusing. So the first thing I want to talk about is the epiglottis. So I get this question from a lot of beginners wondering if they might accidentally be flapping their epiglottis instead of their false chords. And I'm not really sure where people are getting this idea from that they might accidentally be using their epiglottis, but let me explain something real quick. So the epiglottis is made out of elastic cartilage, and there's not many other places in the body that are made out of elastic cartilage. Most of the cartilage in our larynx is elastic cartilage, and also our earlobes are made out of elastic cartilage. And notice how when you flip your earlobe down, it springs right back up. Well, that's what the epiglottis does. Whenever we swallow, the muscles in our neck that attach to a bone in our neck called the hyoid bone. It is a horseshoe-shaped bone in the neck. Those muscles contract when swallowing, and the hyoid bone moves posteriorly into our neck, and it actually causes the epiglottis to fold down over the top of the larynx to seal off the airway and prevent food and water from going down our airway. And there's a few other mechanisms that aid in this closure of the epiglottis, but the second you're done swallowing, it springs right back up to allow us to breathe. So in order to potentially keep the epiglottis closed over the larynx and to exhale to make it flap and produce a sound would require you to kind of like half swallow and simultaneously exhale while holding out that swallow, while continuously contracting the muscles in your neck to keep the epiglottis folded down. And not only is that action just not at all what you would do to activate your false chords, it also sounds completely off the target, and I'm just not sure how anyone could potentially confuse the two sounds. Let me show you what it sounds like to flap your epiglottis. And some people, it might activate your gag reflex like it just did for me, but it literally sounds like you just got shot in the lung and you're aspirating blood. Like if you were a kid playing like Nerf with your friends and your friend shot you in the chest and you played dead and pretended like you were dying, like what kind of sound would you make? You'd be like... So as long as it doesn't sound like you're actually dying and aspirating blood, or it doesn't make you gag, then there's a good chance you're not using your epiglottis by mistake. When a person who is brand new to using their false chords finally starts to get their false chords moving and rumbling, it'll produce like a very inconsistent rumbling sound, and each individual rumble you can almost count on your fingertips. This is because those rumbles that the false chords are producing are not only happening too slowly, but very inconsistently, like it's hard to just keep it going at a constant rate. But through many hours of practice, the false chords eventually begin to vibrate faster and more consistently, and that inconsistent rumbling sound will start to turn into a more consistent vibration noise. And the reason for this is that the false chords are composed of the vestibular ligament, which is wrapped in thin layers of tissue that fold around each vestibular ligament. So at its core, the false chords are a ligament that, for the most part, have relatively been immobilized throughout an entire person's life. I mean, most people don't even know they have false chords. And although they can kind of move and perform certain actions with the movements of the vocal cords, to get them to move at the level we need them to move and to vibrate super duper fast, well, it takes time in stimulating the false chords through movement. Well, what are the effects of immobilization on a ligament? Well, if I casted my elbow in this position for like 3 months and then eventually removed that cast, I would probably lose a significant amount of the range of motion in my elbow joint. And that is because all the ligaments in my elbow and the joint capsule itself would have just gotten very tight and stiff, and therefore motion becomes restricted. And in order to gain that motion back, I would have to work within the available range of motion I do have, push for each individual degree, fighting for each degree of motion deeper and deeper into elbow extension. So you can think about training the false chords similarly to trying to gain extensibility of a ligament. You're not going to get it all in one day. It's going to take time. And in the case of my elbow, where I was casted for 3 months, well, that's just 3 months of immobilization. Consider a lifetime of immobilization. It does take quite a long time to train the false chords to be very, very compliant to moving and vibrating. And that can be kind of daunting, seeing as how the barrier to entry for false chord screaming requires about 5 to 6 months of practice, where in that first month, you're simply just trying to get the false chords moving. So if you can produce that grunting sounds like my advice is to try to do that like 10 minutes a day, 5 to 6 days a week for at least the first month. Now, during those first few weeks that a person figures out how to get their false chords moving, like I said, you'll hear the individual rumbles, and those rumbles will start off very inconsistent, but you'll also hear a lot of engagement of their true vocal cords in the background. Because what happens is a person thinks, I need to make noise with throat, therefore vocal cords do your thing. And they might produce a sound kind of like this. And I'm sure you could hear my voice in the background just going, That is not good. We don't want that. We want to limit the engagement of our true chords and try to isolate our false chords. Especially when you first start a scream, like that first millisecond of trying to set your false chords in motion, a lot of beginners, they'll start on their true chords, kind of like a glottal attack, and then immediately after that, you hear their false chords take over, so that's just unnecessary stress on the true chords. We almost want to imagine that we're letting the airflow bypass the true chords by keeping them very relaxed and keeping the glottis open and allowing that air to collide with our false chords located just a few millimeters above the true chords. Now, luckily, in most people, this is an issue that typically just goes away on its own within the first few weeks of starting to use the false chords and developing that coordination. But being aware of this will maybe expedite the process. Just when you're practicing, really think and analyze how you're doing it, really listen to yourself. Try to be aware of all the sensory feedback you feel. Try to feel, are my vocal cords vibrating? Are my false chords rumbling? Can I isolate that rumbling? You really have to use a lot of that intrinsic feedback, and that can be very hard to do at first, but as you use your false chords more and more over time, you'll become more attuned to that feeling of your false chords rumbling and your vocal cords vibrating either on their own or with your false chords. But I will say that it's not inherently bad to use your vocal cords with your false chords. In fact, advanced level false chord vocalists definitely do use their true chords in conjunction with their false chords. It's just that they do it in a much more controlled way. So for that first initial stages of learning false chord screaming, you definitely want to try to isolate your false chords, and then over time it'll just start to feel really natural and you can incorporate your true chords in a much less stressful way. One piece of advice I have for isolating the false chords and getting rid of the true chord engagement is to try to start with a very relaxed exhale and just do the grunty sigh thing, but you're trying to just stay as relaxed as possible, especially in your throat. You don't want to feel like you're actually contracting any muscle in your throat. Your vocal cords stay open when you're breathing at rest, so you want to leave them open. You don't want to try to like force it or anything. You really just want to imagine you're allowing the air to bypass the true chords and collide with the false chords. And you can kind of ramp into it using just a very relaxed exhale. I also get a lot of requests from beginners who want things like drills and exercises and practice routines. But the thing is, you first have to get that foundation. You first have to figure out how to get your false chords rumbling, isolate them, get rid of the true chord engagement, and then make them more compliant to motion. So I would say literally just the first 1 to 2 months of practicing should just be kind of doing that grunty sigh noise, getting more comfortable with using your false chords. And once you start to get a better grasp of the coordination and how it feels to make your false chords vibrate, then we can do exercises. Now I have a video about warming up, and the same false chord warm-ups that I use are the same exercises that I would recommend to a beginner who's like in their 3 to 4 month range of practicing. So check that out if that's something you want to do, but also those exercises should really just be your warm-up as well. I think the bulk of a person's practice should just be practicing to other false chord vocalists, trying to mimic some of the sounds you hear them produce. It's a lot more fun that way, and I think you'll learn a lot more. You can kind of hear somebody else perform the technique and almost create a mental image of how they're positioning their false chords, their throat, their mouth, trying to recreate that sound for yourself. But also, it's got to be salient. I wouldn't recommend a beginner practicing to like Dickie Allen of Infant Annihilator or Bender of Shadow of Intent or any master level false chord vocalist, because they're just not going to get much from that. They're not really going to be able to imagine how that person is producing some of those sounds with their false chords, because it's just way too high of a level. So I recommend practicing to like old school death metal and maybe early 2000s deathcore vocalists, melodic death metal, even black metal with the super gravelly vocals, because that's just the false chords kind of lightly rumbling. I'm going to put a list of albums in the description that I recommend listening to and practicing to if you are kind of in that 3 to 4 month range. You've really gotten a good grasp of how to regularly use your false chords, and you just need some direction, some kind of target to aim for. Target cannot be super high. It's got to be right at the level that's just challenging enough to stimulate growth, but not too hard that you're not going to get anything out of it. And in the next video, we're going to talk about things like pronunciation, stamina, and getting lower lows and higher highs. So hopefully this video helped you if you're a beginner with false chord screaming. If you liked it and you like the way I explain metal vocals, well, please comment, give a thumbs up, subscribe to Scream Theory. I'll see you guys in the next one.